morning, everybody. This is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association in New York. And today we have Bilal Baloch, who is going to talk about India, Modi's particular politics. Not many people have been following India, but suddenly India is very, very important for people. And it's one of the things that's apparent about this is that whatever's happening in Ukraine, whether it affects India directly or not, it certainly makes India desirable property as Modi plays hard to get at the United Nations and is ambivalent about other people's sovereignty while defending India's own sovereignty and balancing between his sort of ideological friends in the US and the military suppliers and backers over and fuel suppliers, I presume. I noticed they're selling discounted fuel to India at the moment in Russia. So, and of course, looming over the Himalayas is China, which is never far from Indian politicians' mind for fairly obvious reasons. But within all these complications, some people say that with chaos there's opportunity, and we're hoping to hear from Bilal to what extent Modi and the Indian government are trying to seize opportunities and to what extent they genuinely don't know what to do and are being buffeted between competing forces. There's a complex politics here. There's a strong anti-colonial element in Indian politics, possibly because some of the people who ruled my ancestors also ruled India and spent several hundred years despoiling the place. So there's the rich traditions here. But India has also been a prominent member of the non-aligned. People tend to forget that India actually voluntarily provided troops for the Korean War and not on the North Korean side. So all of these factors come together with the change of government there and with what's happening. So, Bilal, explain India's abstention and ambivalence about Russia's invasion of a sovereign state, Ukraine, when India has been so het up about sovereignty for many years.
Yeah, first of all, Ian, thank you for having me. I think you mentioned a lot there. Not sure I agree with some of what you said, but let's unpack some of those causes. So I think the first place to start is exactly where you said, India's abstention, and it's really caught fire in our press, in our media, of course, among the halls of power in the West, in Europe, and especially in the US, whose alliance and relationship with the Indian government has been warming certainly over the last decade at a rapid clip. I think we should really separate out the direct causes behind why India chose to abstain at the UN and particularly at 2 UN votes vis-a-vis Russia and then sanctions on Russia, and the underlying causes. I think the direct causes are first and foremost the evacuation of around 20,000 Indian citizens in Ukraine. Let's not forget that this war is, less than 2 months old. And in recent history, Russia's way of doing war has been incredibly brutal. We just need to think about the siege of Grozny in Chechnya and the way in which that country was razed to the ground in many parts by Russia. And so I think the Indian government's focus on making sure that it was able to evacuate 20,000 of its citizens in Ukraine, which would necessarily involve some level of cooperation and dialogue with the Ukrainians, with Russia, was fundamentally important to its strategic calculus. And I think only one individual was killed in a crossfire, but otherwise nearly all 20,000 were evacuated. I think secondly, and perhaps more importantly for many of your viewers who are interested in international politics, is the political economy of defense. Around 60% of India's defense industry and defense imports over the last 10 years have come from Russia. There is a fundamental dependence on Russian arms, submarines, technology, and there's of course the very important delivery of S400, half of which have been delivered, and the other half are yet to be to make their way into India. And in an environment where not only has Russia invaded Ukraine, but the broader geopolitics point to a changing security environment in Europe, the repercussions in Asia, to fundamentally risk your defense preparedness would be something that the Indians would look at and be wary of. There's, of course, the long-term plan, I think, in most of the circles of power and strategy in Delhi, to think about, how can we eventually indigenize our defense establishment, build a domestic military industrial complex, move dependence away from Russia. But in the short term, that's not going to happen. And so when we think about India's abstention, I think both in terms of its immediate focus on its citizens from a humanitarian and security perspective, as well as de-risking any threats to its defense preparedness in terms of isolating Russia, I think those are the two proximate causes as to why it behaved the way it did. And
what were the origins of this switch to Russian supplies? I mean, originally, of course, it was often British colonial inheritance in terms of aircraft, ships, etc., etc. But it was Congress that made the switch to Russia. And to what extent was this ideological, anti-colonial, and to what extent was it technocratic? The Russian weapons were better or cheaper or whatever.
Well, I mean, I think it's worth reminding your viewers that for most of its post-independence history, when India received independence from British colonial rule in 1947, India was far more inward-looking in terms of its political economy and non-aligned in terms of its foreign relations. And within that milieu, as well as other factors, India had very few allies among regional and global powers that it could turn to. That wasn't just the case for India, that was the case for many other countries coming out of colonial rule. And whereas its neighbor and rival Pakistan went to capitals in Britain and the US seeking out ways to beef up its defenses, India turned to Russia. And there's a bit of history here in terms of how that went about happening, whereas Pakistan became a military-run state pretty early on and was able to use its relationship with the US to really beef up its defenses. That wasn't necessarily India's immediate focus, right? But as it happened, the 1962 war is worth pointing out, which is the Sino-India War. That was the first time that the US and the Kennedy administration was able to help India with arms and cold weather supplies. But against that Cold War backdrop, Russia then came back to India in 1965, playing a mediator between India and Pakistan in order to signal to India that it was in fact autonomous. And then I think the real key point here is the 1971 India-Pakistan War, or also called the War of Bangladesh's Liberation, where the USSR fundamentally supported India, not just in terms of arms, but also at the UN Security Council, sending a pair of nuclear submarines into the Bay of Bengal. And this was fundamental to India's preparedness and ability to win that war. And the other side in Pakistan was supported by the US. So I think the imperatives of the Cold War, of course, yeah. And so the imperatives of the Cold War, I think, brought India into Russia's camp. And you mentioned there the ideological piece. And I think there was already a pretty strong established bridge between certainly the economic technocrats in India and the advisors to the founding prime minister of the country, Jawaharlal Nehru, later his daughter, who would take on the mantle of prime minister in the 1970s. There was, if not intellectual alignment between India's political elite and communist rule in Russia, but at the very least there was far more resonance between them, and I think that's what where the ideological bridge would facilitate some of the defense cooperation as well.
The mystery here is that that bridge is still open, even though Modi is a proponent of American neoliberal politics, and even though Putin has given up any pretense of socialism, even though a lot of people around the world don't seem to have realized he doesn't even pretend to be socialist anymore. So it's interesting how these ghosts of the past keep haunting decisions in the present, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, Ian, it's important not to over-egg domestic politics and its intimate ties to foreign policy. I think, of course, they're tied, and it's some of the same actors who are making decisions around opening up an economy or not, how to move away from import substitution or not, which countries to trade with or not. I think these are all questions that impact domestic politics and a country's growth. But strategic concerns around alliances and geostrategy, I think, also function in a separate domain. You know, they're concentric circles, but different. And whereas there have, you're right, historically been pretty close ties between certainly historically the dominant political party in India, the Indian National Congress, and a more socialist political economy, and the USSR and then Russia, the way India sees its role in the world and how it behaves with allies may seem like it hasn't changed much, but there has been a fundamental shift, and that can't just be reduced down to America's neoliberalism and Russia's socialism. I think there's far more strategic and proximate reasons of hard security, of maintaining and managing a global order that, quite frankly, is in flux. And so I think, whereas looking at someone like Prime Minister Modi, he may come across as a leader who is warming up to the US and a neoliberal vision for India, he's also a leader that has built a pretty strong state sector and given out social services and what would be considered, you know, quote unquote handouts, in a way that would run contra to traditional neoliberal thinking. So I think there's a bit more strategy and politics involved in how the Indian government behaves domestically, but especially internationally. And there we have to look at how it views its place, not just in Asia, but also globally.
There's an aspect here, you're mentioning the domestic politics. Of course, one of the planks of BJP support and rallying has been dog whistle Islamophobia, in a sense, invoking communalism to, you know, a perilous and murderous degree on occasion. And the aspect there is that Congress was persistently pro-Palestinian, you might say, in its outlook. But we've seen a shift now where Modi has been cultivating Israel, and at the same time he's been bashing Muslims at home. Are these related in terms of domestic and foreign policies, or is it something that doesn't really concern your average farmer in the plains of northern India?
I think at a narrative level, yes. You know, if you look at the narratives in the media, if you look at the narratives on the street, you know, there's a transnationalism in the way in which Muslim diasporas around the world think about global politics, right? What goes on in Palestine, what happens with Rohingya Muslims, what happens in Kashmir is not just seen as an international issue far away. Muslims domestically, whether they're in India or whether they're in the US, would consider what's happening in these countries to members of their community, transnational and otherwise, to be of a close issue to them. So if the question is, do Muslims in India think about and hold dear to themselves the plight of Palestinians? The answer would be yes, but I don't think they're unique in that sense. The question about whether Prime Minister Modi's and his party's naked sidelining of the Muslim community, their biggest minority, and overseeing himself a pogrom of the Muslim community in Gujarat when he was chief minister, is tied to how he and his government view geopolitics and the Israel-Palestine conflict. I think that's not significant. There were discussions even under the Indian National Congress about opening up pathways to have relationships with Israel. Even when the diplomatic bridge to Israel was opened up under the Modi administration, that has not prevented international and multilateral comments from Indian decision makers around the Palestinian cause. So I don't think it's a zero sum necessarily. But of course, I think the relationship with Israel has opened up at a time where, quite frankly, even other Muslim countries are building ties with Israel. We've seen that most recently with the Abraham Accords, which, quite frankly, were in the works for several years. Even
the distinguishing feature that I would say is that the Muslim countries kissing up to Israel at the moment are doing so without much in the way of popular backing. They don't have elections. They don't listen to it's profoundly unpopular with their domestic population, with the domestic vote, but they don't have voters with the population.
Exactly.
So, but in India, these issues do play into the public field, and I was just wondering to what degree that was the case.
I think there's enough happening in India today, and has been for several years, that crushes its Muslim minority, that for the Palestinian cause to become to light the touch paper is a far cry. As I said, I think it's absolutely important on a narrative level, but the crushing of Muslim protesters, the sidelining and ghettoization of Muslim communities, the moves made in Kashmir by the Indian state that have essentially turned it into one very large open prison. I think these issues are far more proximate in the concerns of the Muslim community in that country.
You don't see the parallels between the treatment of the Kashmiris and the treatment of the Uyghurs in China as a means of rapprochement between Delhi and Beijing, then?
That's a very interesting question. I think the similarities are absolutely there. I think at a global level, we treat these very differently, because for the Indian state to go into Kashmir and the legislative mechanisms through which it's gone into Kashmir have been touted as very different. And with regards to China, the way in which their treatment of the Uyghur Muslims has been projected has been as, outside the rule of law and crushing them. Now, again, these are interpretations and narratives that we've advanced.
You control the state, you make the law. So
correct, and are both countries sidelining and crushing their Muslim minorities? Absolutely. But the Muslim community in India is also spread far beyond Kashmir. And there are states in which the Muslim community, for example, in the state of Telangana, in the city of Hyderabad, is very much part of the political process. And in Kashmir, it's not, because that's also a geopolitical issue. Whereas the Muslim community in China is not as spread and is isolated in certain pockets, and those pockets are almost exclusively where we've seen the Chinese government is hacking them down. So I think there's far more diverse and varied engagement by Muslims in India, in the Indian political process, than just Kashmir would suggest. But if looking at them in isolated ways, just looking at what's happening in Kashmir and just looking at what's happening in Xinjiang, just looking at what's happening with Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, just looking at what's happening with Muslims in Palestine, these are absolutely communities that are under the cosh of the state because of their faith.
We've had a question from Albert Goldstein, which ties into this to some extent. With Modi's seemingly unshakable political dominance in Delhi, how close is India to an autocracy, and does it matter?
That's a very good question. I think, the political scientist in me would make a distinction between procedural democracy and substantive democracy. I think, India is the largest democracy in the world. It turns out and churns out citizens to come and vote at the ballot at the state level, at the local constituency levels, at the federal levels, in a way that is unprecedented and does so year in, year out. And so insofar as that's how we're measuring democracy, India is a far cry from being an autocracy anytime soon. Even when the state has been captured by an autocratic leader in a strict sense, when civil liberties and its democracy was arrested and paused under Prime Minister Gandhi during the emergency of 1975 to 1977, democracy returned, right? And she was ousted. On a substantive level, I think that's where the conversation gets a lot richer. On a substantive level, where a leader and a party that is using its majoritarianism to undercut religious and ethnic and caste minorities and build institutions in a majoritarian image.
Republican Party.
Right. Well, we can come to that too. And is building institutions in that majoritarian image. I think that there are shades of authoritarianism in that kind of a move. Absolutely.
Yeah, you can still be authoritarian with popular backing. It's what you do to the minorities that matters, I suppose, under these circumstances. Sabina Inderjeet says, India's stand at the UN is disappointing for many, but can it afford to be on the wrong side of Russia when ties with China are strained? And I can quite understand this line of thinking of, we don't have a dog in this fight. Why should we put our economy on the line for somebody else? Even if but I'd feel the temptation to at least register a token disapproval on behalf of sovereignty with Ukraine. So, to what extent is this a real commitment? Everybody, the US blows a whistle and expects everybody to jump into line. But then famously, James Baker over the Balkans originally said, we don't have a dog in this fight. Let them go kill each other. Nothing to do with us. Nothing going on here. Move on. Of course, it didn't work out that way. And in an intricately geoconnected world, what happens in Ukraine and the Black Sea has got repercussions everywhere. Even though it doesn't quite get to the great game, it's not likely to reach India for any time soon, even with all of Kipling's scouts and Kim working on it.
I think that's a very good question. But again, I think we should all be cautious about paying too much attention to pronouncements, with all due respect to your background and experiences at the UN, with what's being said at the UN. We've seen a flurry of foreign delegates, senior delegates from Russia, China, the US, and elsewhere, either visiting or about to visit New Delhi, in order to gain assurances, pass on their perspective, compel India or convince India to see their particular perspective. And I think that is not a bad position to be in for India and Foreign Minister Jaishankar and Prime Minister Modi. This war is less than 2 months old, and India has deep strategic interests in ensuring that the US and their ties with the US stay strong, which I still believe is their main priority and main focus, because they both share a common threat with regards to China. And the role of Russia and measuring where Russia is in the very long term, could India risk losing Russia to China's camp? Sure. But I don't think that's worth considering or being concerned about for New Delhi right now. For New Delhi right now, the concerns are far more proximate and immediate around its defense commitments, especially if, as you implied earlier, this war cascades far beyond Ukraine, leads to a very different kind of security order in Europe, changes the dynamics in the Pacific and the Russia-China relationship. Then India even more so needs to ensure that its defense preparedness is not negatively impacted. And that's on the security side, but also on the domestic side, to link it back to your earlier question. Populist leaders cannot afford to have disruptions vis-a-vis inflation, energy, to their domestic political and economic order. And the second and third order effects of this current war and what it could bring with regards to the price of oil, to inflation, to disruptions domestically, India can ill afford to entertain that. So it's taking, I think, a cautious approach. I think there's a very clear match between policy and strategy here. If you look at the writings and the pronouncements of someone like Foreign Minister Jaishankar, this is strategic autonomy being played out in a textbook way. And India's position has also evolved in less than 6-7 weeks. Right, the Prime Minister Modi has had calls with President Putin and President Zelensky. I think behind closed doors, India and its decision makers are being far more open with their counterparts from Russia and the US. But it is not in any contravention of its historical record for India to internationally and publicly keep a more nuanced line. What I would urge people to do is read between the lines in some of the statements that are coming out in the public. It's never going to be a kind of Washington style, you're with us or against us, or there will be consequences or talk of red lines. That's just not going to happen.
It does. Well, the whole conflict has been bedeviled with what you might call binary thinking, where it's all one or the other, and nuance is as a word it might be used, but as a concept it's not been much used in the course of this. In fact, as you were talking, it reminded me that India's position, if you scale it up, is not that dissimilar to that of the Free State of Ireland during World War II, which, it was very close. It had principles. It had a population that was not very happy with the stand, but it decided to take strategic implications in there. And it was Ireland survived, and it hasn't been reviled as a Nazi sympathizer since, despite being the last place where the Irish Prime Minister went and paid his condolences on the death of Mr. Hitler at the German embassy. They were forgiven. And they kept getting, they kept getting aid from the British and support from the British and Americans afterwards. So there is room, a lot of room, historical room for manoeuvre here. And India is in a position much better than Ireland in terms of people want India's support. Not many people wanted Ireland's support in World War II.
Yeah, and Ian, between your words there, you mentioned at the start of our discussion colonial origins. Right. And, not to make this too theoretical or historical at the cost of talking about the practical realities of politics, but, you mentioned Ireland there. India, Ireland, most of the world have long memories, and those colonial legacies are important. The legacies of the Cold War are important. But the hand that New Delhi has today and the hand that other countries, let's call them post-colonial states, have in Asia, in parts of Latin America, in some parts of Europe, though not too much, is very different. And the kind of world they want to see and actively shape is also very different. So India has absolutely a values and ideas-based alignment with the United States, but it also does not want Washington's global preponderance to return in the way it can, as we've seen through the Cold War, or as a corollary, the British during the Empire. It fundamentally wants to see global power shared and spread, and for the cleavages that brings to engender competitive advantage at an international level. And India wants, and quite frankly, probably deserves that seat. And so, the other side here doesn't just get a vote, but now gets to shape what happens in global politics. And I think that's what we're seeing play out here.
I'm ambivalent about expanding the Security Council. I think shrinking it would be much better myself, but that's another story. We can discuss that on another occasion. But it is, of course, as the famous Speaker of the House here once said, all politics is local. And we're discussing geopolitics, and Modi's strength and his leverage comes from domestic support. So I think this is the real subject of your recent book. To what extent has he consolidated that report? To what extent is he unassailable? Can Congress ever come back to life like a staggering zombie, or is it dead forever? Are there any other parties on the horizon, or is it, as has happened recently, sort of regional state parties coming into ad hoc coalitions to get what they want?
Yeah, look, one adage is that all politics is local, and another is, you're never really out of the game in politics either. So to say the Indian National Congress can never come back is not something that I'm going to sit here and claim, but it seems highly unlikely that it's going to happen anytime soon. Usually the way Uttar Pradesh, India's most populous state, goes, usually the country goes. And the BJP outright won the 2022 UP state election, a state that, prior to the BJP's rise over the last 10 years, had a recent history of being ruled by a series of coalition and state parties. But now the BJP wins outright there, and it wins outright there, even more interestingly, against the backdrop of the thread that you outlined earlier, which is communal politics, right? It also has a pretty sizable Muslim minority. It has a pretty sizable OBC or backward caste minority and set of minorities. And so despite those political countercurrents, the BJP won outright. And it won outright, even more surprisingly, perhaps to some of your listeners, with a pretty strong religious nationalism and authoritarian approach under the leadership of Yogi Adityanath. And so the BJP is set to win, and Modi is set to win a third term in 2024. And the reasons for that are, of course, the performance of the BJP government, the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, and we can go into any of these buckets. But also looking at the other side, it also speaks to the fact that the main opposition, the Indian National Congress, is totally decimated. It's led by a dynast in Rahul Gandhi, who is, by all accounts, a blunt political leader. It's beset by internal strife within the party itself, hasn't been able to manage generational shifts, and has been noticeably absent from a bunch of serious electoral victories. Now, you spoke there of smaller parties, regional parties, and that's where for a long time, certainly since the late 80s, there was a view of India sort of going towards this highly plural, state-driven party system, right? We can think of the Trinamool Congress in West Bengal, the DMK in Tamil Nadu, the Aam Aadmi Party up in Delhi, which was born out of anti-corruption protests 12 years ago, off of which my book is based. The counter-argument would be, can they come together and form a united opposition? But they have not got the numbers and, quite frankly, nor the resources to mount a serious challenge to the BJP. And on both those counts, in terms of mobilization and resources, and then the third pole of Prime Minister Modi and his personality itself, I think make BJP a formidable political machine, and they'll sail through the 2024 elections.
I mean, I was in India in 1983, and the BJP was sort of embryonic and somewhat sort of, how should we say, insular and parochial. But it's been growing. You could see the seeds of it there. It was actually adopting a serious populist approach. It was taking economic measures, etc. So, is this going to consolidate its? Are we faced with a BJP Raj forever, or is there any serious threat to them?
No, not in the short term. I think their threats can probably be listed as the following. First and foremost, not necessarily from the outside. I think if any threats come in, it will invariably be about leadership transitions and leadership changes. The BJP is very much, in terms of its power in Delhi, dependent on Prime Minister Modi and his personality and his leadership and his style of rule. But also, the BJP is backed by a very large right-wing Hindu nationalist sect called the RSS, which has to survive, which has to and necessarily, Ian, has to survive and be bigger than any one individual. And so, if I were to sort of look ahead to, quite frankly, past 2024, because I think that's an assured victory for the BJP, it'd be interesting to see and note how and where do internal cracks appear within the current BJP machine. How does a transition of leadership take place? Modi can't be in power forever. So I think that's actually the more interesting place to look at right now. Of course, the Indian National Congress, which is its only other national level opponent and rival, for many years now, those of us who study India, been looking at the Indian National Congress to see, what will happen. Will there be a change in leadership? Will there be a better management of generational shifts? Will there be, quite frankly, an alternative put forward to what is an increasingly religious nationalist vector within the BJP, which will only grow as its structural power concretizes in Delhi? And what can the Congress party put forward? Quite frankly, right now, the answer is, nothing. And then the third piece are the regional parties. Will we be able to see them come together and provide a united opposition? I think eventually they could get the numbers, but that will take a long time. Resources is the interesting piece. There is an entire political economy of how political parties in India are able to fundraise and bring funds into the party machine. and laws and legislation has been changed and altered to thwart them. And that's happened under the BJP. And they simply, some of these regional parties don't have mobilization at a national level to be able to rival the RSS. So in the short term, Ian, I think those are the three ways in which cracks could emerge to the BJP's hegemony, but we'll only start to see them, if at all, in the medium to long term.
Bearing in mind that the RSS has, let's just say, been implicated in the assassination of Mohandas Gandhi at the start of India. It's transformed now, of course, it claims. To what extent is the BJP prepared in this? We have the politics in India is an expensive business. From an outside point of view, it appears almost as corrupt as US politics. In fact, possibly even more so, in terms of people buying influence, buying votes, funding campaigns in return, in transactional politics, shall we say. So to what extent, if the BJP were to lose, would it be prepared to give up? I mean, you have an authoritarian party with its Hindu nationalist and even fascist origins in some ways, self-assured middle class with lots of money that tends to subscribe to the religious agenda. Would they give up if they lost?
Give up power? So the implication being that would they hold on?
If Donald Trump finds it
constitutionally,
if elements of the American Republican Party find it so difficult to hand over power, as we saw earlier this year, then to what extent, last year, to what extent is the BJP going to be? Yes, you won. It's a fair fight. I'll pull up my stumps and go.
That's a fascinating question, and I think one that we all should be looking at and studying. My book, in part, looks at a period in India's history where the only period in India's post-independence history where democracy and civil liberties and the constitution was superseded by the political executive. And it happened against the backdrop of several variables, from political opposition to ideological threats to an authoritarian prime minister, to the power afforded to her by her party. In short, many shades that we see under Prime Minister Modi and his BJP government. And so I think there is absolutely, we can't rule out that the BJP in its current structural form and with its ideological power, would it view any opposition overtaking it as a threat to its structural position, and would it then seek to extra-constitutionally stay in power? I think that's absolutely on the table. I think it's worth being cautious about some counterpoints to that. I think swinging this back to global politics, India also wants to be a values as well as a strategic-based player in global politics. And so were it to completely throw out the constitution and were the BJP to stay in power, even if they were voted out, that would negatively impact its global politics and its relationships abroad. So I think that's one, but it doesn't need to happen in at such a national federal level. And that would be my second point, which is the BJP has today got the power to be able to sniff out and thwart opposition in ways that are happening today and throughout India. You can change laws, you can change the way voting happens, you can change the way parties, opposition parties are able to raise money. You can arrest party members, you can essentially do what Mrs. Gandhi did overnight in arresting the constitution, but do it in a way that is more subtle and as part of daily politics. And I think actually the BJP has already been doing that. So in other words, to answer your question, the BJP will find ways to make sure, constitutionally and extra constitutionally, that it maintains its power in the event it sees threats, but it will do so in a way that is subtle and in pockets, as opposed to as a big bang emergency move.
Well, there's a sound of silence here in most countries under similar circumstances. So I'm going to intrude on the sound of silence. And where does the military stand in this? Because the Indian Army and the Indian Navy, the Indian forces generally, are almost an oasis of anti-communalism, from what I've seen, that in terms of having a civil outlook. And they've been completely absent from this. Is the BJP doing anything that would ensure military support if it did something? Is it cosseting the military, or are the military able to keep the BJP and the politicians at arm's length?
That's a fascinating question. India generally has a pretty positive history of civil-military relations. And in part, that's due to the colonial origins of independence. India inherited very strong political institutions that were able to, right from the outset, maintain supremacy over the military. And quite frankly, the size of the country has rendered an outsized military that enforces its stamp domestically untenable. Now, that being said, promotions, selections, and nominations are very much in the political realm. And so there are subtle ways in which the BJP can ensure the acquiescence of the military by making sure that, in large part, through these mechanisms that I just listed, its leadership can be ideologically aligned. But also, some of the issues that we're talking about at a domestic level come under the jurisdiction of local security forces, such as the police, and those tend to be ruled by the corresponding states. And that's where I think you do see a lot more of the kind of corruption and politicization that you implied vis-a-vis the military.
Well, in several of the riots, the BJP-controlled security forces came in on the side of the rioters, as I recall.
In Delhi, yeah, because in Delhi, the federal government controls the local security forces and the police, and so that's your clearest example of political masters controlling.
Do you have any concrete examples of the process? Because I remember this is what happened in Yugoslavia once the Milosevic's Serb nationalists took over. It was like the frog in the pond of the water, in the warm water, getting boiling. Suddenly, all of the others realized that almost every officer that had been promoted was a Serb. Almost everybody left was a Serb. All the people in strategic positions were Serbs. And it was done almost without anybody noticing. They began to resent it. That's why they started leaving the federation. But do you have any concrete evidence of a similar process?
Ian, it doesn't have to be at a. It doesn't have to be at a. In the example that you just gave, that's a story of co-ethnics, right? I don't think that promotions and selections need to be of other Hindus within the military architecture for them to be aligned with the BJP. There's also a military-industrial complex. If the military is being supported and backed in terms of leading weaponry, in terms of preparedness, that's something that the political class can do to ensure that the military stays on side as well. But it's not analogous to the Yugoslav situation that you just pointed out, or what we've seen in parts of Latin America, or certainly what we saw next door to India and Pakistan, of co-ethnics being in positions of leadership in order to share an ideological mandate.
Oh, so is there going to be any change? Because I don't know. we're either at the start of a very long war of bloody attrition, or moving towards the end game in Yugoslavia. Sorry, these tropes sticking in one's mind, in the Ukraine and Russia. Is India in a position to offer a ladder for the parties to climb down? Has Modi kept enough distance to say, look, I can be the peacemaker. I will come in and we can work something out, and both of them will be in a position to defer to him. This is the role the United Nations should be playing, but it's, as we have noticed, United Nations is very conspicuous by its absence.
I don't just think that's something to speculate and possibility. I think that's highly probable. In fact, I think that's exactly what India is hoping that it ends up doing. Prime Minister Modi has had calls with Putin as well as Zelensky, and I think it's very much in line with the Delhi's foreign relations today and the world view of Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and the foreign relations that Prime Minister Modi has projected, that they want to be able to be in a position where their strategic interests vis-a-vis their defense trade with Russia and their relationship as a democratic power with the US, but that both those interests can in some form survive. And so being able to be in a position where they can bring together a corridor of countries, of alliances to create an exit for this conflict, I think that's exactly what India has been looking to do. And they've already made mention of, the parties to return to the Minsk agreement, and so forth. And I think what we're going to see with a lot of these foreign visits that are happening right now in India, that behind closed doors, India will be looking to project itself as not a player, but the player that can help bring the parties away from a war of attrition.
This is sort of tied into the question of resources for elections and so on. The overseas Indian component, big in Britain, Australia, it's huge in America now. And I have seen signs from what I can see that they are very often aligned to Hindutva and the BJP. Are these a significant resource base for Modi for the future, for elections, and and for domestic influence inside American politics, come to think of it?
It's a fascinating question. I think, a lot of the polling and the surveys that have come out points to something exactly what you just said. Indian diasporas, certainly in the UK and in the US, tend to be Democrat or Labour or left-leaning at home, and support Prime Minister Modi in India. And can they be a resource to New Delhi? Absolutely. Now, there are, of course, legislative barriers for them to, provide resources by way of capital to political campaigns in India. And there's not enough evidence to suggest that they would necessarily be willing to do that in their droves. But they can absolutely be proponents of Indian interests domestically, not just in political spaces, but beyond that, in business and elsewhere. And we've seen that in diaspora communities far beyond India. So that's not something that's exclusive to India, but the size of it, the size of that diaspora in the UK, the US, Australia, Canada and elsewhere is suggestive. Now, it's important to note that even within those communities, there will be pretty significant cleavages of opinion. I don't think every member of the Indian diaspora will necessarily even look to support politics in India, because within that diaspora, you have Indian-born citizens that are living abroad in these countries. You have members of the diaspora that are 1, 2, 3 generations removed from India. So I think the picture is a lot more complicated than just to suggest that they would one-to-one support the sitting government in India and advance Indian interests. But certainly there's a strong cultural bridge between the diaspora and New Delhi that can be advantageous to not just the Indian government, but Indian businesses, Indian civic organizations. And that's where it goes far beyond just Prime Minister Modi. I mean, think about the Howdy Modi event in Houston a couple of years ago that Trump attended. It sold out an entire stadium. So is the diaspora a powerful and important tool and bridge for Indian institutions, be it private, public, or otherwise? Absolutely. Which direction will they go in? I think there's a lot more variation there. But some of our best evidence suggests that there is salient support for Prime Minister Modi's more ambitious foreign relations and strong leadership in India than there has been previously.
Well, Bilal, we're getting towards the end, and I realise that we've been wandering into such engaging and fascinating questions, even sometimes answers. I've cheated you. Can you explain to the press here what your day jobs are? Tell us about the Inquirer and the Centre for Indian Studies of Pennsylvania. Get your PSA in.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for everyone who's listening and came to the talk. My day job is a co-founder and COO of a technology company called Inquire AI. We deliver expert content and expert insights to businesses and decision makers who are looking to understand the world, whether it be its markets, its politics, from the local right to the global in real time. We have a network of over 300,000 knowledge assets, and we essentially build software that enables companies to tap into expert insights outside of their organization, or even within their organization, by identifying who knows what within their four walls. So that's my day job. That's what I'm building. And I also have an affiliation with the Center for the Advanced Study of India as a non-resident scholar. That's what my previous life as an academic was spent focused on. I just released a book on India off the back of my PhD, which looks at how the Indian government responds to domestic political crises. And the focus is on really centralizing the role of leadership and ideas, which historically has been sidelined as a causal factor in how the Indian government behaves. And that's the PSA.
Okay, I think Jamie is going to put on the screen, I hope, as we go, the CUP book and the Inquire Chiron. But we are coming to the end, almost exactly on time. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. It's brought back memories of this time more years ago than I care to remember, when I met Mrs. Gandhi and Chandrasekhar and George Fernandez and the others. And it's interesting how things have developed in ways that we wouldn't necessarily have anticipated then. And I'm fairly sure that things will develop in ways that we're trying to anticipate now, but not necessarily getting it right. Who'd have thunk about Ukraine and Putin at the moment, for example? A year ago, this would have been a science fiction apocalypse scenario, but it's happening. So thank you all for coming. At the Foreign Press Association, we're trying to broaden the range. We're trying to get away from binary politics, and there's lots of shade. There aren't just goodies and baddies in the world. Sometimes people do good things for bad reasons, and sometimes people do bad things for what they think are good reasons. It's that type of nuance that we need to understand if we're going to cope with the world, because if we think it's all black and white out there, we're going to get grayed out when reality hits us. But thank you very much, Bilal. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everybody. Please subscribe to the Foreign Press Association. please let us know who you are and when you want to come. And by all means, send us money. We're still recovering from COVID. The plague has got us in the death pit still. But thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Hope to see you again, Bilal. Bye.
You too.